Warning! Before we get started, a quick note for listeners. Today's episode discusses cultural controversy surrounding the Super Bowl halftime shows, including questions of representation, audience intent, and public reaction. We'll be talking about language, politics, and media narratives. This conversation is not an attack on any race, ethnicity, or culture. It is a discussion about how large institutions communicate with a national audience, and how people respond when they feel included, excluded, or talked down to. If you're looking for outrage or slogans, this may not be the episode for you. If you're interested in perspective, disagreement without name-calling, and why people can watch the same event and walk away with very different reactions, you're in the right place.
I'll be straight with you. I stopped caring about the Super Bowl a long time ago. Not because I hate football, not because I hate competition, but because the NFL stopped pretending it was just about the game. Ever since the league made politics unavoidable, starting back in the Colin Kaepernick era, the Super Bowl hasn't been a shared American moment. It's been a cultural litmus test. And once again this year, the biggest story coming out of Super Bowl Sunday wasn't who won, wasn't the final score, and wasn't even the commercials. It was the halftime show, and more specifically, the reaction to it. A halftime performance that leaned heavily into Spanish language, adult themes, and cultural messaging, broadcast to a national, family-heavy audience, followed immediately by a backlash where anyone who didn't like it was told why they were wrong, what they were guilty of, and who they must be. At the same time, something else happened that barely got mentioned in the mainstream conversation. Millions of Americans chose to watch a completely different halftime experience, a patriotic alternative put on by Turning Point USA featuring artists like Kid Rock, openly pro-America, pro-faith, and unapologetic about it. Two halftime shows, two very different messages, two very different ideas of who America is and who it's for. So tonight isn't about football. It's not even really about music. It's about something bigger. When the most watched cultural event in the country stops trying to bring people together and starts drawing lines, what happens next, and why does simply opting out now come with a moral verdict attached? That's what we're unpacking today. All right, let's bring in the crew, because this is one of those conversations where perspective actually matters, and you're going to hear very different takes on what Super Bowl Sunday really represented. First up, Brian, our resident MAGA firestarter. Brian doesn't mince words, doesn't care who gets uncomfortable, and has zero patience for institutions that lecture Americans while cashing their checks. If there's a cultural line being crossed, Brian's already calling it out. Next, Rachel, the independent voice on the panel. Rachel's here to slow the conversation down, separate intent from impact, and ask the uncomfortable questions without turning everything into a slogan. If there's nuance to be found, she's the one digging for it. Then we've got Daniel, the guy who always asks why the messaging looks the way it does, and who benefits from the outrage cycle that follows. Daniel connects the dots between culture, power, and narrative control, sometimes a little too well. And finally, Skylar, bringing a progressive perspective without the cartoon stereotypes. Skylar challenges assumptions, pushes back when she thinks the framing is off, and reminds us that disagreement doesn't have to mean dehumanization. This isn't a cheer section, this isn't a pylon. This is Data and Dissonance, where we let the arguments breathe, we let people finish their thoughts, and we don't pretend everyone saw the same thing just because they watched the same broadcast. All right, let's get into it, because this is where the temperature actually rises. What we saw on Super Bowl Sunday wasn't just a halftime performance. It was a cultural fork in the road. On the main broadcast, the NFL put forward a halftime show that clearly spoke to a specific audience. Heavy Spanish language focus, adult themes, provocative imagery, all aired during what's still marketed as a family national event. And almost immediately, the conversation stopped being about whether people liked it or not, and turned into why people who didn't like it were morally wrong. At the same time, and this matters, millions of Americans intentionally tuned out and chose a different halftime experience altogether, a patriotic alternative put on by Turning Point USA, featuring artists like Kid Rock, openly celebrating America, faith, and national pride, without apology, without lectures, and without telling anyone they were a bad person for disagreeing. So this isn't about music taste, it's not about language, and it's not about race. It's about who the Super Bowl is being designed for now, and what happens when a shared cultural moment stops trying to be shared. So, Brian, I want to start with you. When the NFL puts out a halftime show that clearly isn't aimed at a broad family audience and then frames criticism as moral failure, is that representation or is that exclusion disguised as progress?
Yeah, no, I'm not buying the spin on this at all. What people felt watching that halftime show wasn't confusion, it was recognition. Recognition that the NFL isn't even trying anymore to pretend the Super Bowl is for everyone. This wasn't some neutral artistic expression that accidentally upset folks. It was a deliberate choice to center one cultural lane during the biggest, most expensive, most family-marketed broadcast in America, and then dare anyone to object. And when they did object, the league, the media, and the online outrage machine didn't ask why. They went straight to character assassination. You didn't like it? Then you must be racist. You must be ignorant. You must be the problem. That's not inclusion. That's coercion. And here's the part that really ticks people off. Nobody was asking the NFL to cancel Spanish music, Latino artists, or cultural expression. That's the straw man they hide behind. No, what people were reacting to was the attitude, the smug certainty that the audience would either applaud on command or be publicly shamed. This is the Super Bowl, not a niche awards show, not a late-night cable experiment. This is supposed to be the one night where blue-collar dads, suburban moms, kids on the couch, veterans, immigrants, conservatives, liberals, everyone can share the same moment. Instead, it felt like the league was saying, if this doesn't resonate with you, maybe this country doesn't either. That's why the alternative halftime event mattered so much, whether the media wants to admit it or not. People didn't tune into that because they hate diversity. They tuned in because they were tired of being talked down to. They wanted something that felt familiar, welcoming, and unapologetically American without being sarcastic or ashamed of it. No lectures, no moral finger-wagging. Just music, pride, and a reminder that loving your country isn't some extremist position. When millions of people actively choose to leave the main broadcast during the biggest TV event of the year, that's not bigotry, that's feedback. And the NFL can keep ignoring it. But eventually the ratings, the trust, and the shared culture all pay the price.
Brian, that point about feedback is the key thing people keep trying to bury. When millions of viewers don't just complain on social media, but actually leave the broadcast during the most expensive, most hyped television moment of the year, and that's not outrage culture, that's consumer behavior. And instead of the NFL or the media asking why that happened, they jump straight to scolding. That's where this goes sideways for a lot of people. You can't claim you're about inclusion while simultaneously telling a huge chunk of the audience that their reaction is illegitimate by default. That's not leadership, that's arrogance. And I also want to underline something you said that matters. People weren't rejecting culture, language, or artists. They were reacting to being told what their reaction was allowed to be. Once disagreement becomes a moral offense, the conversation is already dead. That's when people stop engaging and start checking out entirely, which is exactly what we saw with the alternative halftime show drawing so much attention. Whether someone liked that patriotic event or not, the fact that it existed and that people actively chose it tells you something important about how disconnected the main broadcast felt to a lot of Americans. So, Rachel, let me bring you in here. When a national family marketed event puts out content that a lot of parents and longtime fans feel uncomfortable with and then treats criticism as a character flaw instead of a preference, is that a failure of messaging or a failure of listening?
I think it's a failure of listening first and a failure of messaging second. And those two things usually travel together. When you design content for a national audience that spans generations, cultures, and values, you're taking on a responsibility whether you like it or not. The NFL still markets the Super Bowl as a family event. That matters. So when parents are sitting on the couch with their kids and suddenly feel like the tone, the language, or the visuals don't line up with what they were promised, that discomfort is valid. It doesn't automatically mean they're closed-minded or hostile. It means expectations weren't aligned. And instead of acknowledging that mismatch, the response was to shame people for even raising the concern. Where this really breaks down is in the assumption that intent overrides impact. You can intend a halftime show to be celebratory, inclusive, or culturally expressive, and still create an experience that leaves a large portion of the audience feeling sidelined. Those two things can be true at the same time. The problem is, we've lost the ability to hold that tension. Instead of saying, some people loved this, some people didn't, and both reactions are understandable, the conversation immediately hardened into moral camps. Once that happens, listening stops because nobody wants to admit they might have misjudged their audience. I also think it's important to recognize why the alternative halftime event resonated with so many people. It wasn't necessarily about the artists or even the politics, it was about tone. People felt welcomed instead of managed. They weren't told what they were supposed to feel or what their reaction said about their character. That sense of invitation matters more than ideology. When institutions forget that, they don't just lose viewers for one night, they lose trust over time. And rebuilding that trust is a lot harder than putting on a different show next year.
That point about tone is huge, Rachel, because tone is what tells people whether they're being invited into something or managed through it. And what a lot of viewers felt Sunday night wasn't curiosity or celebration, it was instruction. This is what progress looks like. This is how you're supposed to feel about it. And if you don't, we already know what kind of person you are. That's not messaging, that's conditioning. And once people sense that, they don't lean in, they pull away. What really stands out to me is how quickly institutions defaulted to motive assignment instead of reflection. Nobody in power asked, did we misjudge the audience, or did we forget who this event is marketed to? The assumption was that the audience needed correcting. And history shows us that when big cultural institutions stop listening and start lecturing, they don't create unity, they create parallel spaces. That's exactly why the alternative halftime show didn't just exist, it thrived. People didn't want to be told who they were. They wanted to feel like they still belonged somewhere. So Daniel, let me bring you in, because this feels bigger than one halftime show. Is culture now being used less as a bridge and more as a compliance test, where the real goal isn't shared experience but sorting people by reaction?
Yeah. This wasn't culture as a bridge at all. This was culture as a sorting mechanism. What we're watching play out isn't accidental, and it's not organic. Big institutions have learned that entertainment is the cleanest delivery system for ideology because it bypasses debate. You don't argue with a halftime show. You either cheer, stay quiet, or get labeled. And that label is the point. Your reaction becomes the data. Who clapped? Who complained? Who opted out? Culture stops being about shared meaning and starts being about compliance. What made this one so obvious is how fast the reaction machine kicked in. There was no pause, no reflection, no, hey, maybe we misread the room. Instead, it was instant motive assignment. If you didn't like it, we already know why. And it's not because of tone, audience mismatch, or content, it's because you. That's classic institutional behavior when confidence collapses. They don't persuade anymore, they diagnose. And once institutions start diagnosing their audience instead of listening to them, they've already conceded the argument. And that's why the alternative halftime show matters so much in this conversation. Not because it was perfect, not because everyone loved it, but because it represented exit. Exit is the one thing institutions fear more than criticism. People didn't protest the NFL halftime show in the streets. They quietly clicked away and chose something else. That's powerful. Parallel culture isn't rebellion, it's adaptation. And once people realize they don't have to accept the lecture to enjoy the moment, the leverage shifts. The danger for the NFL isn't backlash, it's irrelevance. Because when culture becomes a test instead of a celebration, the only people left are the ones already pre-approved to pass.
That word you used, Daniel, exit, that's the quiet part nobody in power wants to talk about. Because exit doesn't trend on social media. Exit doesn't create a viral outrage cycle. Exit just empties the room. And that's exactly what we saw here. People didn't riot. They didn't demand cancellations. They simply chose something else. And the reaction to that choice was anger, not curiosity, which tells you everything about how much control institutions think they're entitled to over public reaction. What really strikes me is how quickly the narrative shifted from, this is inclusive, to, if you don't like it, you're suspect. That's not confidence. That's fragility. If your message truly resonates, you don't need to threaten people's character to defend it. And the fact that a patriotic alternative halftime show outside the NFL, outside the mainstream media ecosystem, drew so much attention says less about politics and more about human nature. People want to feel welcomed, not evaluated. So, Skylar, I want to bring you in here because this is where the tension really sits. Is it possible for institutions to celebrate diversity and cultural expression without turning it into a loyalty test? Or has backlash itself become part of the strategy now?
I think it is possible to celebrate diversity without turning it into a loyalty test, but I also think a lot of institutions have forgotten how to do that, or maybe stop trying. Diversity works when it feels additive, when people can see themselves in it without feeling like they're being erased or corrected. The moment celebration turns into expectation, you should like this, and here's what it says about you if you don't. It stops being inclusive and starts being transactional. At that point, backlash isn't just predictable, it's almost engineered. Where I think some of the disconnect comes in is that decision makers often confuse representation with messaging. They assume that if something checks the right cultural boxes, the audience reaction should automatically follow. And when it doesn't, they interpret that as hostility instead of feedback. That's a mistake. People aren't rejecting diversity. They're reacting to tone, context, and delivery. A family watching the Super Bowl together isn't wrong for expecting content that feels broadly accessible, and they're not morally obligated to celebrate something that doesn't land for them. Expecting universal approval in a country this large and diverse is unrealistic. And I'll say this too. When alternative spaces pop up, like the patriotic halftime event we're talking about, that doesn't automatically mean people are radicalizing or rejecting pluralism. Sometimes it just means they're looking for a place where they don't feel judged. If institutions want fewer parallel cultures, they have to stop treating disagreement as disobedience. Diversity should invite people in, not dare them to leave.
Skylar's point about invitation versus expectation really brings this into focus because what people reacted to on Super Bowl Sunday wasn't diversity, it was obligation. Obligation to celebrate, obligation to approve, obligation to stay quiet if it didn't land for you. And that's a line Americans instinctively push back against. You can appreciate cultural expression and still feel like a national family marketed event missed the mark. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, no matter how badly some commentators want them to be. What makes this worse is how quickly disagreement was reframed as disqualification. Instead of asking whether the NFL misunderstood its audience, the assumption was that the audience misunderstood itself. That's how trust erodes. When institutions stop listening and start diagnosing, people don't argue, they disengage. And disengagement doesn't make headlines, but it changes behavior. Channel changes, streams switch, alternative events grow. That's not rebellion, that's choice. Super Bowl Sunday didn't just give us a halftime show, it gave us a snapshot of where American culture is right now. One experience told viewers what they should feel, another offered a place to land if they didn't, and the reaction to both revealed something deeper than music or politics ever could. This wasn't about football, it wasn't even about halftime. It was about who still feels welcome in shared American moments and who doesn't.
All right, quick pause from the conversation. Because keeping Data and Dissonance independent means keeping the lights on without corporate filters or talking points. If you believe conversations like this still matter, if you believe questioning institutions doesn't make you a villain, head over to the Data and Dissonance merch store. We've got gear that lets you say it without yelling. Hats, hoodies, mugs, bumper stickers, and more. All designed to back the idea that thinking for yourself is still allowed. Every purchase helps support the show, supports independent media, and helps us keep doing episodes like this without answering to anyone but you. data-and-dissonance.printify.me. All right, let's wrap this up with some final thoughts.
Here's where I land on all of this. What happened on Super Bowl Sunday wasn't some freak reaction or one-off outrage cycle. It was the predictable result of years of institutions forgetting who they're supposed to serve. The Super Bowl used to be one of the last cultural moments where Americans didn't have to agree with each other to sit in the same room and enjoy the same thing. That's gone now, not because the country suddenly became hateful, but because disagreement itself has been recast as a moral failing. When people feel like their reaction is being judged instead of heard, they don't lean in, they leave. And that's the part nobody in power wants to talk about. Exit doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't trend. It doesn't burn down buildings or flood timelines with hashtags. It's quiet. It's people changing the channel, muting the broadcast, pulling up an alternative stream, or deciding they just don't care anymore. That's not extremism. That's autonomy. And the more institutions respond to that autonomy with scolding instead of self-reflection, the faster they accelerate their own irrelevance. This episode was never about language, music, or where an artist comes from. It was about tone, intent, and belonging. One approach told people how they were supposed to feel and what it meant if they didn't. The other simply offered a space without judgment. That contrast explains the reaction better than any think piece ever will. Americans don't need to be managed. They don't need to be corrected. And they definitely don't need to be told that opting out makes them bad people. If the biggest cultural events in this country want to bring people together again, the answer isn't louder messaging or harsher labels. It's humility. It's remembering that shared moments only work when people are invited, not sorted. Until that lesson sinks in, we're going to keep seeing parallel cultures grow, not because Americans hate each other, but because they're tired of being talked down to. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller series. Stories about power, corruption, and what happens when institutions stop telling the truth and start protecting themselves. If this conversation resonated with you, these books will too. The Covenant Protocol, The Prophet Directive, Black Echo Rising, available now on Amazon. Links are in the show notes. And if you want something to listen to when the noise gets loud, check out Uncaged, raw, unapologetic music about standing your ground when the world wants you quiet. Streaming everywhere you get your music. Supporting the books and the music helps keep Data and Dissonance independent. No sponsors telling us what to say, no filters on the conversation. As always, thank you for listening.